In this video I'm going to be looking at Ancestral Sources version 7.9, which was released in March 2025. There are several new features and a number of problems fixed. This video will look at a few of those new features, but for a full list of changes, Google Ancestral Sources version history or visit the link that's on the page there. So the first feature is that Ancestral Sources is now available in the Microsoft Store. You'll find the Microsoft Store link on the Start menu, and also you may find it's pinned on your taskbar, and you'll be able to search for Ancestral Sources and you'll get the download page that I'm showing you here. The nice thing about having it in the Microsoft Store is that I think it gives a bit more legitimacy to the program. It means that people are more likely to trust it because it does go through a kind of vetting process by Microsoft. And probably the best feature is that it will automatically update. So when I release a new version, you should find that within a day or two your version updates, or you can always come to the Ancestral Sources page on the Microsoft Store and update it yourself there. You'll see an update button if there is one available. Probably the most significant new feature in version 7.9 is the ability to record monumental inscriptions or gravestone inscriptions. So the MI icon here is now available in the toolbar. You'll notice the probate one is still greyed out. That's not available yet. That'll be a future version. So, as is usual with all of the other sources, you can link an image of the gravestone if you wish. You can record the repository. If you use templated sources, you can record the details of the template there as well, and a lot of that will be filled in for you. So it works as you would expect Ancestral Sources to work. So you would typically record the place where perhaps the gravestone is, and you'd record the location within that place. So it could be that it's at St Elphin's Church in Warrington. The reference ID, as usual, is to record the details of the citation, the reference number for the citation for this gravestone. Other information you may or may not use. It's an optional field that you might want to enter data into. The subtype allows you to select whether this is a grave marker, a gravestone, a headstone, etc. And the index field here is designed to be used to, in this particular case, to record the plot number. So generally when you find a gravestone, it's in a particular location in the churchyard. So if you know that information, you could record the plot number in there. So then you can begin to add the individuals who appear on the gravestone inscription. And so I've selected the first person here, Samuel Appleton, and we've now got a series of boxes, text boxes and list boxes that we can select to enter details in. Now typically most gravestones have very little information on there. They'll typically have the name, it might have the age of the person when they died, so maybe Samuel was 90 when he died, and it will typically record perhaps the death date. So he perhaps died in 1912 on say the 5th of April. And that might be all that's there. So typically I would expect you wouldn't be filling in very many of these fields, but just sometimes you will get gravestones with much more information on, or different types of information. So maybe he was cremated rather than buried. Perhaps the date of birth is recorded, maybe the cause of death. Perhaps it records the date that he was buried, perhaps instead of the death date, or as well as. It may have his occupation recorded on the gravestone, where he lived, where he was born, where he died. So all of that information can be recorded. Typically you wouldn't fill the burial place in, because that, in most cases, they'll be buried in the same place as the gravestone appears. So we've already recorded at the top that this is in St Elphin's Church in Warrington. But if you do record the burial place, then that will kind of override that. The Ancestral Sources will assume that probably means that it records on the gravestone that this particular person was buried elsewhere. So you can then select other people who appear on the gravestone, and so I've now added Mary Alice. So what you'll see is that we've got at the top here sort of tabs which record the two people. So we've got Samuel Appleton and we've got Mary Alice, and we can flick between those two different people to enter in their details. We can also scroll up and down using the scroll bar to look at their information. So for Mary Alice, perhaps she died at age 70, perhaps she died on the 15th of September in 1913, and perhaps it recorded that she lived in Stockton Heath in Cheshire. And we could add more people to the gravestone, and we can continue to add those individuals in. I'll just record something for Mary Alice as well. Perhaps she died young, and maybe she therefore died in let's say the 4th of June 1890. And we can carry on adding people as we wish. You'll see that because I'm not using templated sources, it's creating the title for me using the title template, and it's saying that it's got Samuel Appleton and 2 others. So by default that's the format that's used. You can change the format of the titles in the options as usual. The reason that Samuel is shown as being the only name shown and 2 others is because he's the key individual. So we can see we've got that one. We've got a yellow key there, whereas next to Mary Alice we've just got a black key, and the same for the other Mary Alice. So if I clicked on this key here, that would make Mary Alice the key person, and she would now appear there. How you decide who the key person is up to you. It may well be the person perhaps who you feel is most important to you on that gravestone. If you make a mistake in terms of the order that you add people and you suddenly realise they're in a different order, you can use these up and down arrows to move the people around, or you can drag and drop these names at the top to change the order of them. As usual, you can click the auto and choose a template. There are rich text templates with the R next to them and the plain text ones. The standard gravestone is probably the one you would choose mostly, and that produces a kind of guess of the transcript for you. You may well need to edit this and move things around, copy and paste things around, which obviously you can do, and use the various editing tools to do that. Once you come to save it, well, I'm getting warnings because I've not added a reference and I've not added an image, and then you'll be given the choice to record a birth fact if you wish for each individual, which would be calculated from the date of death given and the age. So it's estimating that Samuel might have been born in 1821. In this case, I'm not going to make changes to the birth fact because he already has a birth fact recorded, but I might add a citation for it if I felt that it kind of backed it up. And you can do that for each of the people. And then when you click finish, you'll then get a similar option to ask if you want to record a death fact for each of the individuals, and so on. And then you'll get another option to see whether you want to record burial facts for each person. So again, you can make the decision as to whether you want to make a change or update the details, and so on. So that's quite flexible. There is also in the options, if we look at the options for Monumental Inscriptions, you can, if you wish, if this is something that you do, you can have it record a custom event for you. If you typically use a custom event in Family Historian to record that there's a monument for the person, you could do that, enter the name that you want that to be, and then if you leave these two ticked, it means that it will use the burial or death date, depending on which is given, and the age of death will be recorded as well if that's recorded. But other than that, the Monumental Inscriptions place and address will just follow whatever it is that you've recorded at the top here. We're looking at baptisms now, and new to this version, in the Further Information tab, we now have a drop-down list for subtype and an index. We can leave those blank, we don't have to fill these in, but the subtype allows you to select whether it's a bishop's transcript, a non-conformist record, or a parish register. And you can, as you'll see shortly, you can edit those lists yourself and change them if you wish. And the index is there because for a while there's been complaints that there isn't really anywhere to enter in the index or the number that appears on parish registers, and my advice has always been to just enter those in to the source text just before you finish editing. So for example on here we'd fill in that number at the end. Well, now we have a box to type that number into, so 123, and that now appears down there, and we can see that the subtype that we select from here now appears on the new auto text templates that are included with this. So it mentions that's a non-conformist record, or it's a bishop's transcript, etc. That same feature appears, for example, on marriages, and we can see that there. We've got some other things. We can choose that it's a marriage certificate rather than a parish register, for example, but there's also the index there as well. And if I choose the, for example, the parish register for 1837 onwards, we can again type in the index there, and that appears within the source text as we wish. While I'm discussing marriages, I'll also mention that there's a new field now for the marriage registration date. That I know appears on the Scottish marriage certificate. So now if you enter in the date that the marriage was registered, that then appears, we can see down here on the source text. So those subtype and index options will appear on most of the other source types. So for example, on Monumental Inscriptions, we've already seen that earlier, and we've got the index there that we can use to record the plot number. For burial, we've got similar, but for example, for birth, I couldn't really come up with a list of options for the birth, the subtypes for the birth, so it isn't showing in there. But if we go up into tools and options, look at the options for births, we can see that down here we could, if we wanted to, turn on to show the subtype list, and we'd be able to select from there. Now when we do look at marriages, you can see, as well as the subtype list there has always been other types of lists. So the marriage type allows you to have by bands, by certificates, etc. And when we're selecting individuals, there's a marriage status, so you can select whether they're divorced, spinster, etc. So now in this version of Ancestral Sources, in the Tools menu, there's a new Edit Lists option, and this allows you to, so for example, the baptism subtype, you can add, edit, remove options from here. So we can add other options if you wanted to, other than bishop's transcript, non-conformist record and parish register. And that's the same for the other subtypes as well. That marriage status that's been in Ancestral Sources for a long time, you can now edit those entries if you want to. And the marriage type, the by bands, etc., you could change those, and so on. The other new feature for this version is that there is a standard list of occupations that can be edited, and you can add to those if you wish. And this can just save you time when you're typing in the name of an occupation, or it could help you to make sure that you always write it in a particular way, a standard way of describing it. So when you now select individual, you'll be able to, if you want to, select from a drop-down list of occupations. You can ignore that completely and just type in your own if you wish, but that feature is there. If you don't want to use this drop-down list of occupations, then you can turn those off in the options screen. But they appear even for census entries. So if I go to a census record, that list is there for the occupations too. So for the more technically minded, just to mention that under the Tools and Auto Text Template Editor, in fact I'll go to the baptism entry type first. So if we go to Tools and Auto Text Template, we can, if we look at the 1813 onwards parish registers, we can see that in order to use that new index field, I have used a new index keyword that fills that in, and then this source subtype is what we use to show the fact that it's a parish register or a bishop's transcript, and so on. And for marriages, that date registered uses the date registered keyword that's in there. So I'm hoping that these new features will be very useful to you. Just before I finish this section, just to mention that if you do choose, for example, that this is a bishop's transcript, if you happen to be somebody who uses the templated sources, you'll see that automatically gets pulled through to the register type field for this template there. In census entries, many of our ancestors will have the occupation recorded as scholar, and you may feel that it isn't right for that to be recorded as an occupation fact. It's not particularly an occupation, it's just recording that they were at school. So for many years now, there's been an option in Ancestral Sources to specify that you want scholar ignored, so scholar doesn't generate a fact, and that's under the usual tools and options. Well, in this version of Ancestral Sources, I've changed that so that it now no longer says about scholar here, it says don't record if in the census not occupation list. So if I tick that entry there, and then if we go to the new Tools and Edit Lists screen, you'll see that there's a Census Not Occupations entry here. And if we choose that, it lists at school, scholar and school. So if you enter any of those three items as occupations for individuals, then Ancestral Sources won't generate a fact for them. And you can customize this list, and you can add other options to the list if you wanted to. You might decide, for example, that you don't want something like at home to be recorded as an occupation. So that list is there. You can customize it as you like, but as I say, remember that if you want to use that, you need to change that option in the census entry options as I showed you before. Okay, so tools and options, and then choosing census settings, and make sure that you've ticked that box there. As you know, in Ancestral Sources, when you enter in a place, so for example, start to type in W and A, and then it suggests to me that it may be Warrington, Lancashire that I'm entering. So it's very helpful. It saves a lot of time. But sometimes it can be difficult to know perhaps exactly how you've recorded the place, and maybe it's not always as easy to select the correct place as it could be. So now, anywhere where you see a place and address text box, you'll see these three dots, this button following it. If you click that, you get the new place and address picker. So if I remove the Warrington from there, we get a list of every single place within the file. So we could just simply select a place from the list, or you can filter by beginning to type in. So if we type in Liverpool, we start to see then that there's two records in here, so they've been not very consistent, the person who created this file, because there are two options for Liverpool. And if you click on those, we can see the addresses that have been associated with that place in this family history file. So if I select the Brownlow Hall record there and click OK, they get filled into these place and address boxes here. You can also use this contains option here, and so for example I could type in Bristol and it shows me all of the records that contain the word Bristol in there, so that I can select one of those, and again below we'll see the associated addresses. You don't have to choose an address, you can just click OK and the address won't get filled in. And you'll see that option on all of the other entries. So wherever you've got a place, you can always choose that from there. On my computer here, this screen is running in 100% scaling. And so this is a setting within Windows that can be used to change the scaling of your screens. So on, for example, laptops, very often they will be running at 125% scaling or 150%, and sometimes people have quite large, very high resolution monitors, sort of 4K monitors and things like that, where if you ran them in 100% mode, you wouldn't really be able to read the text very well. So again, typically people will run those in a higher scaling. Now, in previous versions of Ancestral Sources, the scaling was dealt with by Windows itself, so it would scale up the screen, but you'd find that the text would be a little bit blurry, and there were one or two people who'd complained about that. So I spent a lot of time with this version. It's one of those things that I'll have spent a lot of time on, but hopefully most people won't spot. So they can actually now deal and adapt to what's known as high DPI scaling. So you should find that the text is sort of sharp and easy to read at whatever scaling you might run it at, and the screen should adapt itself to fit in with the resolution. The other change that I've made is to the tools and customize, and there are now more parts of the screen that you can specify the colour of for the different elements, and there are also some more colour schemes. So in the list here, the colour schemes that were always in Ancestral Sources have now been renamed to have Classic after them, and there are now other colour schemes available. The light olive is very, very similar to the scheme that we're looking at, but there are some subtle changes within there, and there are other schemes such as light sandy, which uses a slightly more family historian style colour scheme. And there are also some dark themes as well, so if you like to use dark themes, they can be easier on the eye. There's a dark theme now available that works quite well and looks pretty good, I think. Personally, I quite enjoy using the dark grey scheme. It's another one. So you can have a play around with those and try those out. There's also options to change the size of the toolbar images across the top so that they grow larger if you wish as well. And again, that'll be dependent on the resolution of your screen as to whether that's of interest to you. And you can, of course, also change the font, and you should find the font size of the font. So you should find that changing the font size, Ancestral Sources adapts better than it used to do to that. So it just takes a little bit of time, and then we end up with it rescaling itself for that font size. For those of you who like to develop your own auto text templates, or you like to edit the existing ones, I thought I'd just run through some of the new features that have been built in. When I started to look at how to deal with monumental inscriptions, it was obvious that potentially you could have any number of people, 10, 20, 30 or more people recorded on a monument. And so I needed a way for the template to be able to deal with the potential for any number of individuals to be selected. So in this version of Ancestral Sources, we now have the concept of being able to create loops, which are standard within most programming languages. So if I go to Tools and Auto Text Template Editor here, we can see that there's obviously a lot of code here, and all of this code that's here is the information that can be displayed for one person. So it could be that the gravestone includes birthplace and residence, cause of death, and so on. So all of that information is in there, and this is all controlled by this new loop function, which allows a variable, in this case person index, to start off with the value of 1, and it's going to, each time around the loop, it's going to increment. It'll become 2 and 3 and 4 until it reaches the value of person count, and person count is a new function which returns the number of people in this monumental inscription record. Person count does also work with Census, as I'll discuss shortly. So each time around the loop, person index is 1 the first time, and then 2, and so on. So there is a new person keyword and also a get function, and that get returns the value of the variable that's referred to. So in the first time around, get person index will be 1, the next time around it'll be 2, and so on. So this basically says, let's display the person. Which person do we want? Person 1, person 2, person 3, and then let's display their residence and their address. So it's a little bit complicated, but for those of you who are more familiar with programming and who enjoy using auto text templates, you can hopefully start to get your head around that. If I look now at Census, and if we just select a couple of random records to add to this census, and I go to the template editor, I've created a new split table template, as much as anything as a kind of an example of what could be done using these new features for Census. What that allows us to do is, as you can see on the preview below, it splits the census table up into multiple sort of subtables. So one of the problems you can have with Census is that the number of columns just becomes so big that it will be too wide when it's displayed or printed out on a report. So what this template does is it splits the columns up, and on this first line here I'm using this new set function, which creates a variable, and in this case I've called it column break, and it set that variable to 6, so it initializes it to 6. And this is also another opportunity to show you that there's a new keyword, which is this double slash symbol here, and that is used to create annotations or comments so that you can explain what's happening on that line. So that's the number of columns that are required. So we can see below we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns there. And then below here we end up using a loop, and that loop will loop around all the different people, and it will create the sort of multiple tables as required. I'm not going to go into the details of it here. It's something that perhaps we can look at in future in another video in more detail. But being able to put these comments on the end of the lines is very, very useful. Even if you don't have a comment to write, it can be useful just to split up very, very long lines of text. I know that a lot of users of Ancestral Sources like to make use of the Ancestral Sources data entry plugin, which is in the Family Historian plugin store, and that's used to just run Ancestral Sources straight from Family Historian. Well, that plugin is now being phased out in favour of a new plugin called the Ancestral Sources Launcher plugin. And the difference with that is it doesn't bring up any kind of dialogue. You just click the plugin and it runs Ancestral Sources. One of the downsides to doing that is that you then lose the entry that was in the previous plugin, which allowed you to close Ancestral Sources automatically after you'd saved an entry, so it could then return back to Family Historian again. So if you still want to use that feature, I've now built that into Ancestral Sources itself. So up on the File menu, and then this new After Save entry, you can choose this option to close AS after save, and then it will behave exactly as it did before if you had that option chosen in the plugin. So as soon as you save, it closes. For those of us who don't use the plugin, there is this other option here, which is Minimise AS after save. So that means as soon as Ancestral Sources saves your new details, it will minimize Ancestral Sources, revealing Family Historian behind it. So typically I'd be using Family Historian, doing some work in there, and then I want to create an entry in Ancestral Sources, so I click Save. I can then move over to Ancestral Sources, create my entry, save it, then it minimises, and now because it's minimised, Family Historian now comes back to the front and it notices that the file has changed and asks if you want to reload it, so you can say yes. So that minimise option works quite well. I would warn you, don't use the Minimise AS after save if you are using the plugin and you want to keep using the plugin each time you want to run Ancestral Sources, or at least be careful, because you might end up having lots and lots of versions of Ancestral Sources running all at the same time if you use that. So the close AS after save is really designed for those who like to go for that option if you use the plugin.